Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're digging into the wildly fascinating historical forces that basically propelled Charles Darwin's theory of evolution to absolute dominance. We often just assume that groundbreaking scientific ideas succeed purely on the strength of their data, but the reality of 19th century Europe was much, much more complicated than that. And understanding how this whole thing unfolded isn't just ancient history, it actually fundamentally shapes how we still argue about the relationship between science and human consciousness right now. So, let's jump right into this. If you look at the historical records, the empirical scientists of the day actually gave the origin of species some pretty resoundingly negative reviews at first, which means its massive success relied on something much deeper. The scientific establishment back then saw severe gaps in Darwin's arguments, and early reviewers totally excoriated its lack of strict empirical proof. So, if the scientists weren't initially buying it, who exactly was? Well, this is where it gets incredibly interesting. Thinkers completely outside the realm of biology eagerly co-opted Darwin to fuel a massive ongoing cultural and philosophical war over the very nature of human existence. Take Karl Marx, for example. He literally saw Darwin's theory not as a biological triumph, but as a political weapon. Marx believed it provided the empirical rationalization needed to strike a mortal blow against teleology, which is just the idea that the universe has some grand purpose or design. To make sense of this whole ideological battlefield, here's our roadmap for the 19th century debates. First, the philosophical stage. Second, the materialist charge. Third, the dualist pushback. Fourth, the physiologist's middle ground. And finally, the epistemological conclusion. All right, part one, the philosophical stage, preparing the ground for a revolution. Let's look at the intellectual climate in Europe right before Darwin published his work. A deep wave of doubt had already been building up for literally centuries. By the time Darwin actually provided a scientific explanation for life without God in 1859, the philosophical project of pushing religion out of the picture was already just waiting for a champion. Intellectuals, from Spinoza all the way to Schopenhauer, had spent centuries cultivating this narrative of doubt. Society was actively searching for a non-theistic account of life, and Darwin simply provided the scientific capstone to a philosophical foundation that was already firmly set in place. Moving into part two, the materialist charge and the rise of scientific materialism. This philosophical eagerness actually exploded into the open during the 1840s in Germany, triggering what became known as the materialism controversy. The crucial point here is that early radical materialists, guys like Ludwig Buchner and Jakob Moleschott, weren't just practicing science in a vacuum. They were using chemistry and physiology to explicitly rule out divine revelation. They looked at the rapid advancements in fields like chemistry and boldly declared that everything in the universe, including human consciousness, was nothing but atoms in motion. No soul, no afterlife, no divine creator, just matter. Just listen to this incredibly provocative statement by physiologist Carl Vogt from 1847. It perfectly captures how these early materialists completely shocked Victorian society. He basically reduced human consciousness to a biological secretion. I mean, imagine telling a distinguished Victorian gentleman that his most profound moral and spiritual thoughts were roughly equivalent to a bodily fluid like bile. It was utterly scandalous. But of course, that was exactly the point they were trying to make. As you can probably guess, this aggressive reduction of the human soul to pure matter absolutely terrified the conservative establishment, and it triggered an immediate, fierce counterattack. The stakes were just incredibly high, because if humans were just complicated chemical reactions, well, then traditional morality, religious authority, and honestly, the entire social order could be completely dismantled. Which brings us to part three, the dualist pushback, where theology and philosophy strike back. So, theologians and post-Kantian philosophers mobilized fast. They were defending dualism, the idea that the soul and the body are fundamentally separate entities. Thinkers like Emanuel Hermann Fichte and Hermann Lotze argued that no matter how well you map the brain's physical structure, you can never mathematically explain the subjective experience of self-consciousness. It's one thing to say a nerve impulse travels at a certain speed, right? But it is entirely another thing to explain how that physical impulse somehow creates the profound, unified experience of a self-aware I. They argued that the necessity of a logical thought or a beautiful idea simply cannot be reduced to the mechanical clashing of atoms. Now for part four, the physiologist's middle ground, where science begins to question its own limits. Caught squarely in the crossfire of this massive ideological war were the actual working scientists and physiologists of the late 19th century. They were desperately trying to distance themselves from both the political radicalism on one side and the theological dogmatism on the other. So, between the radicals and the theologians, you get this fascinating third group, agnostic scientists in the middle. They insisted that while they studied the mechanics of life, they absolutely could not explain the origin of the mind. They were empirical scientists doing cutting-edge biology, but they completely rejected the arrogance of the radicals, who claimed that science had figured everything out. Even within that scientific middle ground, there was massive tension. You've got Rudolf Virchow insisting that his mechanical cell theory simply stopped at the boundary of the soul. But then, his former student Ernst Haeckel pushed for this vitalist concept of a cell soul, where matter and spirit are intrinsically linked. Haeckel essentially tried to split the difference. He proposed a kind of monism, where even the simplest, most basic biological cell possesses a tiny bit of consciousness or spirit. It was a really imaginative attempt to somehow reconcile Darwinian materialism with the obvious reality of conscious experience. Then you have Émile de Bois-Reymond, who famously delivered a really devastating blow to the extreme materialists. He coined the term ignorabimus, which is Latin for "we will not know." He argued that while we can track the exact movements of atoms in the brain, it is utterly inconceivable how those physical movements magically create the feeling of pain or pleasure. It was a bold, public declaration of scientific humility. He was basically saying that science operates only on mechanics and conservation laws, which leaves the subjective experience of consciousness entirely beyond its reach. Finally, Part 5, the epistemological conclusion, pitting method against metaphysics. This intense debate over the limits of biology really culminated with the philosopher Friedrich Albert Lang. He brilliantly synthesized the whole culture war in his monumental work, The History of Materialism. Lang essentially concluded that assuming everything is physical is a really great rule for doing laboratory experiments. But the moment you claim physics is the only thing that exists in the universe, you've abandoned science for ungrounded belief. He made this absolutely crucial distinction between epistemological materialism, which is just how we study things, and metaphysical materialism, which is claiming to know what those things ultimately are. Science requires the first one, but falters when it presumes the second. Lang used this beautiful analogy to explain his synthesis. He compared it to an organ. Just as dismantling an organ pipe is never going to help you find the beautiful melody it produces, dissecting brain tissue is never going to help you find the human soul. You can map out every single mechanical condition, every nerve, every biological structure, but that is literally just the plumbing. The spiritually significant, aesthetically moving experience of reality, the melody itself, is an emergent quality that mechanical reductionism simply cannot grasp. Ultimately, looking back at these key takeaways from the 19th century culture wars reminds us that Darwin's theory was thrust into a much, much larger ideological battle over humanity's place in the universe. It was a battle where scientific materialism ultimately hit an unbreakable epistemological wall. The early success of Darwin's ideas was powered just as much by a societal desire to reject theology as it was by actual empirical science. And yet, as the brightest physiological minds of the era discovered, stripping the universe down to pure matter still couldn't explain the reality of the self. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. If 19th century science couldn't explain the emergence of the soul, can modern science do it today? Where do you think the limits of science truly lie? Have we actually bridged the gap between matter and consciousness? Or are we literally still staring at the exact same beautiful mystery that captivated the Victorians? Thanks so much for learning with me today, and keep asking the big questions.